In the frozen, steel-colored waters of northern Norway, far above the Arctic Circle, a shadow rested beneath the mountains. It did not move. It did not fire. Yet it shaped the course of an entire war. The German battleship Tirpitz lay hidden in narrow fjords, wrapped in camouflage nets and coastal fog, watched over by anti-aircraft guns, and surrounded by cliffs that seemed carved specifically to protect it. To the men who sailed the Arctic seas, it was not a ship. It was a nightmare made of steel, waiting patiently for the order to kill. If this story were only about firepower, it would end here. But what the Allies feared most was not what Tirpitz had done, but what it might do if it ever left its sanctuary. Launched on April 1st, 1939, under the approving gaze of Adolf Hitler himself, Tirpitz was the pride of the Kriegsmarine. She was the sister ship of the infamous Bismarck whose brief but violent rampage across the Atlantic in 1941 had ended with her destruction by the Royal Navy. Hitler was determined that Tirpitz would not share that fate. Instead of risking her in open seas, he transformed her into something far more powerful, a threat that did not need to attack to achieve victory. Displacing over 52,000 tons fully loaded, Tirpitz was one of the largest battleships ever built in Europe. Her armor belt reached thicknesses of over 12 inches. Her deck armor was designed to defeat even the heaviest bombs then in existence. 8 15-inch guns sat in for massive turrets, capable of hurling shells weighing nearly a ton, each across 17 miles of ocean. Against such force, few naval vessels could survive more than a few minutes. But Tirpitz's true weapon was fear. By early 1942, following Germany's occupation of Norway, Hitler ordered the battleship north. The fjords offered deep water, narrow entrances, and natural concealment from air attack. From these hidden anchorages, Tirpitz threatened the Arctic convoys, the long and perilous supply lines running from Britain and North America to the Soviet Union. These convoys carried tanks, aircraft, fuel, food, and ammunition. They were the lifeline keeping Stalin's armies fighting on the Eastern Front. Every sailor knew the rules of the Arctic. The cold could kill you faster than enemy fire. Ice built up on decks until ships threatened to capsize. Visibility vanished in seconds, and somewhere beyond the horizon, Tirpitz might be waiting. In June 1942, that fear became catastrophic reality. Convoy Piku 17, one of the largest Arctic convoys assembled, was ordered to scatter after intelligence suggested Tirpitz had put to sea. British escorts withdrew, leaving the merchant ships alone in hostile waters. German submarines and aircraft descended on them like predators. Out of 35 ships, only 11 reached their destination. The rest were destroyed, their crews left to freeze or burn in the Arctic night. Tirpitz never fired a single shell, yet she had achieved one of the most devastating Allied naval losses of the war. News of the disaster reached London within days. Winston Churchill was incandescent. In private correspondence, he raged that no other target in the world consumed his thoughts like Tirpitz. As long as the ship existed, entire fleets were tied down to guard against her. Aircraft carriers, battleships, destroyers, and thousands of sailors were committed to watching a vessel that rarely moved. The beast, as Churchill called her, had to be destroyed. But that decision raised an impossible question. How do you kill something designed not to die? Early attempts were crude and desperate. Royal Navy submarines prowled the fjords, risking detection by German patrols and underwater listening devices. Torpedo attacks were planned, aborted, and tried again. RAF bombers struck whenever weather allowed, only to watch their bombs bounce harmlessly off Tirpitz's armored decks or explode uselessly against the surrounding cliffs. Each failure added to the ship's legend. German propaganda seized the narrative eagerly. Tirpitz became a symbol of Nazi engineering superiority, a floating fortress immune to British weapons. For her crew, life aboard the ship was strangely comfortable compared to the collapsing Reich. Fresh food arrived regularly. Shore leave was granted. There were concerts, libraries, and even Christmas celebrations. While cities burned across Germany, Tirpitz sat protected, a steel island of relative safety. Yet, beneath that calm, the tension never disappeared. Every air raid siren sent sailors scrambling to battle stations. Every distant engine noise raised the possibility that this time, the Allies had found a way through. They slept beside ammunition, ate beside guns, and lived with the knowledge that if the ship capsized, escape would be nearly impossible. Meanwhile, in Britain, frustration turned into obsession. Over time, a hard truth emerged within the RAF and Royal Navy. Tirpitz was not a problem of courage or effort, it was a problem of precision. Conventional bombing simply could not do the job. To destroy the beast, the Allies would need something entirely new, a weapon that did not merely explode on impact, but penetrated deep into the ship's heart before detonating. And somewhere in England, an engineer named Barnes-Vollis was already sketching the solution. Before we go any further, take a moment to asterisk, click the subscribe button, and like this video. Asterisk. It helps this story reach more people who want to understand how legends are truly destroyed. What the Allies did not yet realize was that solving the Tirpitz problem would demand not just new weapons, but a transformation of the men who would deliver them. The next phase of the war against the beast would be fought not by fleets, but by young airmen flying farther, lower, and more precisely than anyone had ever dared, and many of them would not come back. By the end of 1942, Tirpitz had become more than a military objective. It was an argument. Every time Allied planners met, the same question resurfaced. How many men? How many aircraft? How many resources should be sacrificed for a ship that rarely moved? And yet, every convoy commander knew the answer. As long as Tirpitz lived, nothing in the Arctic was ever truly safe. The longer the ship survived, the more dangerous it became. Not because it attacked, but because it might asterisk. The first serious efforts to destroy Tirpitz relied on brute force. RAF heavy bombers struck whenever weather and range allowed, dropping thousands of pounds of explosives onto a target protected by mountains, smoke screens, and some of the most intense anti-aircraft defenses in Europe. The fjords funneled bombers into predictable approach paths. German gunners rehearsed constantly. Shells burst in the air like iron flowers, tearing holes through formations before bombs could even be released. When bombs did hit, they failed to do meaningful damage. Tirpitz's deck armor absorbed the blasts. Near misses shook the ship but left her operational. Each attack ended the same way. Lost aircraft, dead crews, and another entry in the growing list of failures. In 1943, the Royal Navy turned to sabotage. A daring operation using midget submarines, known as X-Craft, crept beneath Tirpitz's hull under the cover of darkness. The crews faced suffocating conditions, mechanical failures, and the constant threat of detection. Against all odds, explosive charges were placed beneath the ship and detonated. The blast tore open sections of the hull and temporarily crippled Tirpitz. For the first time, the beast was wounded, but she was not dead. German engineers worked feverishly. Repairs were made in place, shielded by smoke generators and reinforced defenses. Anti-aircraft batteries multiplied. Torpedo nets were improved. Radar coverage expanded. Mons Tirpitz was once again capable of threatening the Arctic routes. The message was clear. Even direct hits beneath the hull were not enough. BT's point to Allied frustration had hardened into grim determination. Inside the RAF, a realization began to take shape. The problem was not courage, numbers, or persistence. The problem was physics. Conventional bombs detonated too early. Their explosive force dissipated outward, wasting energy against armor designed to absorb it. To destroy Tirpitz, a weapon would have to strike with surgical accuracy, penetrate deep, and explode where armor mattered least. That solution came from Barnes-Vollis. Vollis was not a soldier. He was an engineer with a near-obsessive belief that structure determined destiny. He had already proven his worth with the bouncing bomb used against the Ruhr dams in 1943. That weapon had shocked the world, but Vollis saw it as only a beginning. His new design was something far more radical. The Tallboy bomb weighed 12,000 pounds. Shaped like a giant dart, it was designed to fall at near supersonic speed, punching through earth, concrete, or steel before detonating underground. Rather than blasting a target apart from the outside, Tallboy attacked from beneath, using shock waves to rupture foundations and hulls. On paper, it was perfect for Tirpitz. In practice, it demanded something unprecedented from the men who would carry it. Only one aircraft could lift Tallboy, the Avro Lancaster. Even then, the planes had to be stripped down. Armor plating was removed. Defensive gun turrets were taken off. Crews flew with minimal protection, trading survival for range and payload. Bomb aiming had to be exact. A miss by even a few dozen meters rendered the attack useless. The responsibility fell to an elite unit already etched into British legend. 617 Squadron. By 1944, the famous dam busters were no longer the same men who had flown over the Ruhr. Casualties, transfers, and time had reshaped the squadron. In their place stood a new generation of airmen. Some were barely out of training. Others had survived multiple tours and knew too well what failure looked like in flames. They were told very little at first, only that their target was the most heavily defended warship on Earth, hidden beyond the Arctic Circle, only that their mission would involve extreme range, extreme cold, and no margin for error. Training intensified. Crews practiced precision bombing again and again, flying long hours over empty countryside, learning to release their weapons with almost mathematical accuracy. Mistakes were not corrected gently. Lives depended on perfection. The first Tallboy attack on Tirpitz came in September 1944. It was an extraordinary mission, flying Lancasters from Britain to northern Russia, refueling, and then striking Norway from an unexpected direction. The plan was bold, complex, and fragile. When the bombers arrived, German smoke generators filled the fjord within minutes. The target vanished behind a gray wall. Bombs fell blindly. Some struck nearby hillsides. One Tallboy detonated close enough to cause serious damage, bending armor plates and knocking out systems. Once again, Tirpitz survived, but survival came at a price. The damage meant the ship could no longer operate safely in her northern anchorages. Repairs were incomplete. Speed was reduced. Commanders faced a choice they had long avoided: leave the safety of the deep fjords or risk being immobilized permanently. That decision would change everything. As Tirpitz prepared to move south, the RAF reviewed every failure, every near miss, every lost crew. They understood now that success would not come from overwhelming force, but from a single, perfectly executed blow. And they also understood something far more unsettling. The next attempt would likely be the last, because if precision failed again, there would be nothing left to try. By the autumn of 1944, the war was closing in on Germany from every direction. In the east, Soviet armies were advancing relentlessly through occupied territory. In the west, Allied forces had broken out of Normandy and were pushing toward the Reich itself. For the men aboard Tirpitz, the illusion of isolation was beginning to crack. The fjords no longer felt untouchable. The war, which had seemed distant for so long, was finally arriving at their anchorage. It was in this moment of mounting pressure that the most consequential decision of Tirpitz's final months was made. German command ordered the battleship to be relocated from her northern hideouts to Tromsø, approximately 120 miles to the south. The move was meant to place her beyond the reach of Soviet advances, while still threatening Allied convoys. On paper, it was a sensible compromise. In reality, it was a fatal exposure. For the first time since her arrival in Norway, Tirpitz would sit within near direct range of RAF bombers flying from Britain. The news electrified Allied planners. Winston Churchill, who had tracked the ship's every movement with obsessive intensity, saw the opportunity instantly. There would be no delay, no reassessment, no acceptance of partial success. Tirpitz had to be destroyed, regardless of cost. The order was clear. Renewed attacks would continue until the beast was finished. For the air crews tasked with carrying out that order, the cost was measured in risk beyond anything they had yet faced. Lancaster bombers were modified even further. Armor plating, already minimal, was stripped away entirely. Gun turrets were removed to reduce weight. Additional fuel tanks were installed inside the fuselage, filling the aircraft with the sharp, unmistakable smell of highly volatile 100-octane fuel. The planes became flying fuel tanks, one spark away from catastrophe. Ground crews wore soft-soled shoes while working around the aircraft to avoid creating static sparks. Every movement was deliberate. Every mistake could ignite the bomber before it ever left the runway. The men who climbed aboard these aircraft understood exactly what they were risking. On October 29, 1944, the first major attempt from Britain was launched. 617 Squadron, joined by 9 Squadron, took off on a mission that would last more than 13 hours. The route carried them across the North Sea, over mountains, and into some of the most unpredictable weather on Earth. When they reached Tromsø, clouds covered the fjord. The target was invisible. Bombs could not be released. Fuel was running low. One by one, the aircraft turned back. It was another failure, another return flight heavy with frustration and relief in equal measure. There was no time to process it. Orders came almost immediately for a second strike. What the aircrews did not know was that the Germans may have been waiting. Evidence suggests that radar installations, including powerful Wurzburg and Freya systems, had been repositioned inland. These radars were capable of detecting bombers at long range, even over water. Nearby airfields, including Bardufoss, housed experienced fighter pilots, many of them veterans of earlier air battles. If the RAF was detected early enough, interception was inevitable. Yet the orders did not change. In the early hours of November 12, 1944, nearly 200 young airmen gathered at their stations in northern Scotland. Some wrote brief letters home. Others said nothing at all. The routines were familiar. But the atmosphere was different. This was not just another mission. Everyone sensed it. As the Lancasters lifted into the dark, engines straining under their massive loads, the crews disappeared into the night sky one by one. Beneath them lay freezing seas. Ahead of them waited a ship that had defied destruction for years. Before continuing, take a memento asterisk. Asterisk, click the subscribe button and like this video. Asterisk. Asterisk. It helps ensure stories like this reach more people who value the sacrifices behind history's turning points. Hours passed in near silence. Inside the bombers, men monitored fuel consumption, engine temperatures, and navigation instruments. The cold crept in despite heated suits. Frost formed on windows. The smell of fuel never faded. As they crossed the Norwegian coast, the question lingered in every cockpit. Had they been seen? No warning flares rose. No fighters appeared immediately. For a brief, dangerous moment, it seemed possible that the bombers had slipped through undetected. Then, the fjord appeared below. Smoke generators were already working, pouring thick clouds across the water. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, their shells bursting in black patterns that crept closer with terrifying precision. The Lancasters descended into the storm of steel, each aircraft lining up for a bombing run that had to be perfect. There would be no second chance. As bomb doors opened and Tallboys began to fall, the fate of the beast and of hundreds of men trapped aboard her hung in the balance. Dawn was breaking over northern Norway on November 12, 1944, when the first Tallboy bombs began their fall. From high above the fjord, they dropped silently, accelerating toward the hidden battleship below. For the crews watching through bomb ammo windows, there was no explosion at first, no reassuren, only the long, unbearable seconds between release and impact, when everything depended on aim, altitude, and fate. Then the fjord erupted. One Tallboy struck close enough to Tirpitz to rip open the seabed beneath her hull. Another punched directly into the ship's armored structure before detonating deep inside. The explosions did not simply tear metal apart. They lifted the battleship, twisted her internal framework, and shattered bulkheads designed to withstand naval gunfire. Shockwaves traveled through the steel like earthquakes. Inside Tirpitz, chaos replaced routine in an instant. Men were thrown from their feet. Lights went out. Compartments flooded at terrifying speed. Power failed. Communications collapsed. Officers struggled to understand what was happening as alarms screamed throughout the ship. In seconds, the list that sailors feared most began to appear. Tirpitz was capsizing. The battleship rolled heavily to port, her massive guns swinging uselessly as gravity took over. Some crewmen managed to scramble onto the deck, only to find it tilting beneath them. Others were trapped below, sealed inside compartments by twisted steel and rising water. Escape routes vanished. Air pockets shrank. Darkness closed in. Within minutes, the Unsinkable ship lay on her side in shallow water near Tromsø, her hull torn open, her decks submerged, her legend destroyed. More than 900 German sailors were aboard Tirpitz. That morning, over 1,000 survived. Many pulled from the freezing water by nearby boats, but at least 971 men were killed, most trapped inside the overturned hull. Some survived 4 hours in air pockets, pounding on steel that rescuers could not cut through in time. For them, the end did not come with fire or glory, but with cold, darkness, and silence. Above the fjord, RAF bombers turned for home. Crews scanned the smoke below, unsure at first whether they had succeeded. Then the shape of the battleship became clear. Tirpitz was no longer upright. She was no longer a threat. After 5 years of obsession, failure, innovation, and sacrifice, the beast was dead. The strategic consequences were immediate. Arctic convoys could now sail without the constant fear of annihilation. British and American naval forces were freed from defensive duty and reassigned to other fronts. One of the greatest psychological weapons of the Third Reich had been neutralized without ever firing its guns in anger. For the airmen who carried out the mission, celebration was muted. Many were exhausted beyond emotion. Some had lost friends on earlier attempts. Others understood how close they had come to never returning. Survival, more than victory, was what lingered in their thoughts. In Germany, the loss was devastating. Tirpitz had been a symbol, a promise of power that no longer matched reality. Her destruction underscored what many already feared. The Reich was losing, not just territory, but the ability to protect its myths. Decades later, fragments of Tirpitz still lie scattered along the Norwegian shoreline. Rusted steel plates emerge at low tide. Concrete gun emplacements crumble in silence. Veterans who survived the mission remembered the cold air, the vibration of engines, the smell of fuel, and the moment they realized they had finally done what once seemed impossible. The battleship that dominated Allied strategy for years was not defeated by brute force or overwhelming numbers. She was defeated by precision, by persistence, and by young men who flew into the unknown to destroy a legend.